Greetings, students, and welcome to another edition of Mr. Zoller's Social Studies Podcast. Now, today's edition is part 2 of a 3-part series on the original 13 English colonies in the New World. And part 2 is focusing on the middle colonies. So what I'm going to do is give you a very brief introduction to the stories of 4 of these original 13 colonies. And your job is going to be to take those stories and decide who is the founder of each of those colonies, and then why was that particular colony founded. Are you ready? All right, let's get started. The first colony that we're going to talk about today is the colony of New York. Now, the first European to explore this region was a man named Henry Hudson. And Henry Hudson was an Englishman, but he was actually sailing for the Dutch. And what the Dutch decided was that this region would be an excellent place to put a trading post, a place where merchants could trade with Native Americans for furs and pelts. And this trading post is going to become the city of New Amsterdam. Now, in New Amsterdam, everyone was focused on economics, and that led to some pretty interesting unintended consequences. Specifically, because everybody was focused on trade, they were not paying a lot of attention to what religion you were. As a result, in New Amsterdam, you have Catholics, French Protestants, and Jews who are all allowed to buy land in this city. Now, by the way, this city of New Amsterdam that we're talking about is eventually going to become known as the city of... Do you have a guess? That's right. It's going to become the city of New York. Now, therefore, you might wonder, how is it that we have what will be an English colony that starts its history as a Dutch colony? Well, the answer to that is it's not handed over to the English lightly. In fact, it has to be taken by force. The English and the Dutch at this time are colonial rivals. The English are jealous of this successful trading post that the Dutch have created, and so they send warships into the harbor. At the time, the Dutch didn't have a chance of withstanding an attack from the English, and so they had to hand over control of this colony to the English. So what started out as the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam is going to become the English colony of New York. Now, that's the story of the colony of New York. But the colony of New Jersey has a shared history with the colony of New York. So I'm going to tell the story of these two colonies together. As we already know, this region started out under Dutch control, and then the English come in and take over the colony from the Dutch. So now the region is under the control of the King of England, whose name is Charles II. Well, Charles II actually hands over control of that region to his brother, the Duke of York, whose name is James II. So now James II is in charge. But James II actually decides that this region is too large for him to administer over himself. So what he does is he breaks off a piece of that region, and he gives that piece to 2 of his friends, Lord John Berkeley and Sir George Carteret. So now this region that had been a part of New York has now been given to these 2 other guys, and that's going to become the colony of New Jersey. So even though they started out as all one region, eventually they become 2 separate colonies with 2 separate charters. So that's New York and New Jersey. Now, let's switch our focus and talk about another colony, which is Pennsylvania. And whenever you talk about Pennsylvania, you have to talk about a man whose name is William Penn. And inevitably, when I talk about William Penn, I have at least one student who asks me, Mr. Zoller, is that the guy from the Quaker Oats box? And I actually had to go look this up. The answer is no. The Quaker Oats guy is not William Penn, but William Penn was a Quaker. And that's why the 2 of them look so similar. Now you might wonder, well, what is a Quaker? Well, a Quaker is a religious group. Specifically, it's a branch of Christianity, and it was founded by a man whose name was George Fox. Now, the Quakers were not very popular in England at this time. And it's because many of the beliefs of the Quakers created a lot of friction with the other English citizens. Let me see if I can give you some examples. The Quakers believed in the importance of an individual's direct connection with God, which of course would downplay the importance of religious leaders. So that's not something that's going to make them particularly popular with the Anglican clergy, for example. They also believed that all people are equal before God. Well, that's not something that's going to go over very well with the English nobles. and they opposed war. They refused to serve in the army. That's something that's not going to make British citizens very happy. As a result, the Quakers were persecuted in England. They did, though, have one person on their side, and that was William Penn. Now, William Penn came from a wealthy family. In fact, he was a childhood friend of King Charles II. So he has what are, by all accounts, a very bright political future. That's why everybody is so surprised when he announces that he's going to kind of turn his back on this and become a Quaker. But William Penn decides he's going to leverage whatever political capital he has left for not only his own sake, but the sake of the other Quakers in England. And what he does is he goes to Charles II and he proposes to him that Charles create a new colony that would allow Quakers to practice their religious beliefs. And he kind of couches it as a win-win situation. He says Charles II has the opportunity to get rid of a bunch of these Quakers. These Quakers would be leaving England and practicing their religion outside of the view of the majority of Englishmen. It's also then an opportunity to help out his friend. Remember, William Penn was a childhood friend of Charles II. They go way back, and so this would be an opportunity to do his friend one last favor. William Penn, meanwhile, has the opportunity to create a new colony where Quakers can freely practice their religion. And Charles II says yes. He creates this new colony, which becomes known as Pennsylvania. And William Penn, meanwhile, does his part. He drafts a document called the Frame of Government of Pennsylvania. And that document outlines the religious freedoms that the colonists there are going to enjoy. In fact, William Penn refers to this colony as a holy experiment. What do you think of that phrase? What do you suppose he means when he says a holy experiment? Think about that for a second, and when you're ready, unpause the video and we'll talk about it. And we're back. All right, what William Penn means is he wants this to be a place where Quakers can practice their religion, but not just Quakers. He wants it to be a place where Protestants, Catholics, Jews can all come together and practice their religion without fear of being persecuted for their beliefs. Now, write that down, and then we'll go on. All right, now William Penn's beliefs were pretty different from what we see in many of these other colonies at the time. In fact, he went beyond just allowing other Europeans to practice their beliefs freely. He also believed that Native Americans should be treated with respect. He spoke out and promoted the fair treatment of Native Americans, including he believed that the colonists should pay for land that was taken from Native Americans. Now, let me ask you a question. Do you suppose that means that all encounters between Pennsylvania colonists and Native Americans were peaceful? The answer to that question is, of course not. That would be unreasonable. We can't assume that all encounters are going to be peaceful. But we will see less friction in Pennsylvania between the colonists and Native Americans than what happens in many of the other colonies at the time. There's one more colony for us to talk about in this podcast, and that is the colony of Delaware. Now, Delaware begins its history much like New Jersey began its history as a part of New York. What we see in Delaware is that this document that was written by William Penn, the Frame of Government of Pennsylvania, is going to attract colonists from all over Europe, including a group of Swedish colonists, and those are the people who eventually will become the founders of Delaware. And much like what we talked about in New Hampshire, where you have a settlement that grows over time, as more colonists arrive, they're going to push further and further into the interior, as well as further up and down the coasts. That's what we see happening in Pennsylvania. And so there's a part of Pennsylvania that's referred to as the lower counties, and we see that down here on the map. Eventually, because that area is located so far away from the capital of Pennsylvania, which is Philadelphia, William Penn allowed them to begin electing their own assembly, and eventually they're going to get their own charter and become the colony of Delaware. Well, those are our 4 middle colonies. Let's see how much of this information you were able to come up with. Why don't you pause the video and see how many of the founders and the reasons founded you can name, and then unpause the video and we'll check your answers. All right, here's what we've got. Let's start with the colony of New York. New York was founded by Dutch colonists originally. And the reason that that colony was founded was to promote both religious freedom and economic opportunity. Now remember, the driving force really is that economic opportunity, but we have religious freedom that comes kind of as a byproduct of that. Next, we have New Jersey. And New Jersey begins, remember, as part of New York, but then it's broken off and given to two men, John Berkeley and George Carteret. But again, these two colonies were founded and they provide religious freedom as well as economic opportunity. Third, we have Pennsylvania. The founder of Pennsylvania is William Penn. And the reason that Pennsylvania is founded is to provide religious and political freedom for Quakers, specifically for Quakers, although we also see that religious and political freedom extended to others, at least initially in that colony. And last, we have the colony of Delaware. Delaware was actually founded by some Swedish settlers who came to Pennsylvania, settled in those lower counties, and eventually that breaks away and becomes its own colony, and they were there seeking economic opportunities. Well, that's it for today's edition of Mr. Zoller's Social Studies podcast about the Middle Colonies. I hope you've enjoyed it, and keep studying the social studies.